The air inside the courtroom was stifling with silence, thick with the kind of tension that doesn't need shouting to be heard. A black woman stood near the gallery, her hands folded neatly over a leather-bound folder. Her eyes were calm but observant, too observant for the comfort of Officer Darrell Sims, a uniformed deputy known around the courthouse for his smug demeanor and subtle cruelty. He had seen her walk in, quiet and unassuming, and immediately made up his mind, another civilian who didn't know her place. He gave her a long, assessing look. Not out of curiosity, but judgment. The kind of gaze that pierces without speaking, that says, "You don't belong here." And she had seen that look before. Many times. But she remained still, breathing slowly. Waiting. Before we get deeper into what happened next, welcome viewers to Craft Tales. This is your space for powerful true stories told through emotion, conflict, and transformation. And if you're visiting for the very first time, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe. We're about to take you on a journey of prejudice, power, and poetic justice. But here's a question to think about as the story unfolds. Would you recognize your boss if they walked into a room dressed as someone beneath you? Would you pause before judging? Or, like Officer Sims, would your assumptions make you blind? In today's story, we witness a moment that starts like many others. A routine day in a courtroom, a woman simply taking her seat. Yet the outcome is anything but ordinary. A decorated law enforcement officer, a woman of color, walks into the courtroom for a personal matter. She says little. She carries herself with quiet strength. But instead of being treated with dignity, she's harassed, interrupted, disrespected, and finally publicly embarrassed by a white officer who's unaware of who she truly is. In his mind, she's just another voice to silence. But he's about to learn a truth that will flip everything on its head. The woman in question, let's call her Commander Elise Monroe, was not there in uniform. She had dressed modestly, navy slacks, a white blouse, and a tailored jacket. Her badge wasn't visible. Her status wasn't announced. Because she wasn't there to pull rank. She was there to observe proceedings and support someone quietly. But Officer Sims didn't need a reason to act. His eyes saw only her skin, her presence, her confidence, and to him that was threat enough. He made comments under his breath, scoffed when she asked for directions, and intentionally directed her to sit at the back, despite her legal right to sit closer to the front. She didn't argue. She simply watched. This isn't the kind of story where someone yells or flips a table. It's subtler. More chilling. Because racism, especially in institutional spaces, doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It lives in posture, in tone, in the small ways people are told they don't matter. That's why this story matters, not just because of the poetic twist at the end, but because of how familiar the beginning feels. Because this isn't about one bad cop. It's about what happens when those in power get too comfortable being unchecked. Let's rewind just a bit. Officer Sims had worked in the district courthouse for over 6 years. He knew the routine: early morning roll call, prepare the docket, make sure nobody brought in phones or attitude. He saw himself as the gatekeeper of order. But behind the uniform was a man steeped in bias, a man who looked at defendants and whispered comments about their appearance, who took a little longer to verify IDs if the name didn't sound American enough, and who often felt challenged when confident black women spoke too clearly or stood too tall. He didn't see Elise as anything but a disruption. What he didn't realize was that Elise had been through much harder trials than this. Her resume read like a force of nature: former military intelligence, decorated SWAT negotiator, current nominee for division chief in internal affairs. But she wasn't flashy about it. In fact, she preferred not to be recognized, especially in spaces where silence taught more than speeches. That day she chose to listen, to watch. But even her silence was interpreted as rebellion. Sims saw her calm posture and decided it was defiance. So he walked over, arms crossed, voice dripping with mock authority. "Ma'am, this area's for court participants only," he said, despite knowing full well it was a public court. She replied politely, "I'm here for the hearing. I'm not interfering." That should have been the end of it. But Sims leaned in as if proximity gave him power. "You need to move to the back. We don't make exceptions here." Elise didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head and calmly asked, "Is that a court order?" That irritated him more. He didn't like being questioned. Especially not by someone he had already decided didn't deserve respect. His voice grew louder. Eyes in the courtroom began to turn. But here's the thing about Elise Monroe: she had faced down armed criminals in alleys with less tension than what now simmered in that courtroom. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just looked him in the eye, and that quiet confidence unsettled him more than any protest ever could. Sims wasn't used to being met with dignity. He was used to compliance. But Elise's very presence felt like a challenge, and in his eyes that was reason enough to escalate. Around them murmurs spread. Some people recognized her. Not by name but by presence. She had that rare aura of command, someone who didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. A nearby attorney gave a subtle nod. A clerk looked up from her files, watching intently. And still, Sims pressed on, determined to prove a point to a woman who had done nothing wrong. But the more he tried to assert dominance, the more obvious his bias became. And Elise, she just waited. Because she knew something he didn't. She knew that justice, like leadership, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in quietly. Sometimes it lets fools show themselves before revealing the truth. And she was about to reveal something that would shatter the fragile power Sims thought he held. But not yet. Not until he pushed further. Because sometimes, letting injustice reveal itself is the loudest statement of all. She remained composed. Hands still clasped. Not a word spoken out of turn. The courtroom clock ticked slowly. The judge was late. The room waited. And so, dear viewers, as we enter this unfolding moment of tension and revelation, pause and think, how many times has someone been misjudged because of how they look, not who they are? How many Elise Monroes have walked into rooms, only to be reduced to stereotypes before they speak? This story is one of many. But it shines a light on something deeper. The systems we allow to exist when we let assumption replace truth. When we let a uniform give permission to disrespect. And when we forget that true leadership never has to announce itself. It simply is. On Craft Tales, we believe in stories that wake people up. Not just entertain, but shift perspectives. And this tale, of a cop blinded by arrogance and a woman cloaked in quiet power, does just that. Because this isn't about revenge. It's about reality. About how quickly the tables can turn when truth walks into a room. Officer Sims thought he was in control. But the lesson he was about to learn would stay with him forever. And for those watching, the takeaway would be unforgettable. So, what happens when a racist cop harasses a woman he thinks he can humiliate, only to discover she's the incoming chief of police, tasked with overseeing his conduct? What happens when the person you disrespect is the one who holds your future in her hands? We'll explore all of that and more in the next sections. But for now, remember this: sometimes silence is power. And sometimes the most dangerous weapon is dignity. If this introduction has you intrigued, stay with us. There's so much more to come. We'll walk you through the confrontation, the shocking reveal, and the aftermath that shook the department. But before we continue, if you haven't already, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to Craft Tales for more powerful true stories like this. And now, let's step into the courtroom's next chapter, where the badge of truth finally comes out. The courtroom was bustling with noise, the clatter of legal documents, the murmured conversations between lawyers and their clients, and the quiet buzz of people waiting for their cases to be called. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in downtown Atlanta's municipal courthouse, but something extraordinary was about to unfold. Officer Brent Halley, a decorated cop with a known reputation for his no-nonsense attitude, walked into the courtroom. His presence often drew side glances, some out of respect, others out of unease. Brent believed in law and order, but often on his own terms, and those terms didn't always favor people who didn't look like him. On the other side of the courtroom, calmly sitting in the gallery, was a poised black woman named Tanya Hill. Dressed professionally in a navy suit with her hair tied back neatly, she exuded confidence and calm. She wasn't a defendant. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't even a plaintiff. She was simply observing. Tanya, a high-ranking officer recently appointed as interim police chief, had arrived quietly and without ceremony. She was conducting a surprise review, part of her mandate to understand how law enforcement interacted with the community in courtrooms across the city. Brent didn't know who she was. He spotted her from across the room and immediately made assumptions. A black woman seated in the back, alone, taking notes? Suspicion flared in his chest. Probably trouble, he muttered under his breath. Without waiting for confirmation, without considering that she might be there on official business, Brent stormed across the room, towering over her. "Ma'am, you can't sit here," he barked. "This area is reserved for witnesses and court officials." Tanya looked up, her expression calm but firm. "I have clearance," she replied evenly. "I'm observing proceedings." Brent didn't believe her. His tone hardened. "Clearance from who?" he demanded. "Let me see some ID. You people can't just walk in here and act like you own the place." The courtroom quieted. Heads began to turn. The subtle racism wasn't subtle anymore, it was on full display. Tanya slowly reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her credentials. She didn't wave them like a weapon. She didn't raise her voice. She simply handed them to him, watching his face for the inevitable change. Brent read the ID. His expression froze. Interim Chief of Police, Tanya Hill. For a split second, his face paled. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down. Anyone could have printed this, he scoffed. I need to verify this with the station. His voice was louder now, trying to assert control. Tanya raised an eyebrow. You're free to call, she said. But I'd suggest you do so quickly. There are eyes on you now, officer. Brent hesitated. The courtroom clerk was already on the phone. In less than a minute, the truth would be broadcast. When the clerk nodded and confirmed it on speaker, the courtroom went dead silent. Tanya Hill wasn't just anyone. She was Officer Brent Halley's new superior, the woman appointed by the mayor to clean up corruption and rebuild trust between law enforcement and the people. The realization hit Brent like a tidal wave. He had just humiliated his boss publicly in front of dozens of people. Worse yet, he had done it based solely on his prejudice and assumptions. The judge, having returned to the bench, called the room to order but paused when he noticed the tension. Tanya stood and addressed the judge directly. Your Honor, may I speak? She asked. The judge nodded, curious. I came here today to observe how the justice system treats civilians. I did not expect to become the subject of the very injustice I sought to measure. Her words echoed throughout the chamber. What occurred here today is not just a moment of disrespect. It is a reflection of systemic issues that must be addressed. Brent tried to interject, but the judge raised a hand. Officer, I suggest you remain silent. The murmurs in the courtroom returned, some sympathetic, others critical. Tanya turned toward the audience. This is not about me. This is about what happens when we allow assumptions and bias to override facts and dignity. Had I not been wearing this badge, had I been any other black woman, what would have happened today? Would I have been arrested? Removed? Silenced? Her questions weren't rhetorical. They were indictments of a system that had failed too many for too long. Later that afternoon, news of the incident exploded on social media. Court attendees posted short clips of the interaction. The video of Brent demanding Tanya's ID and dismissing her credentials went viral. Hashtags like #ChiefTanyaHill and #JusticeInUniform began trending. The public, already tense from recent high-profile discrimination cases, now had a new example of how racism wasn't just alive, it was breathing inside the very institutions meant to protect. The police department couldn't ignore it. Brent was placed on immediate suspension pending an internal investigation. But Tanya wasn't interested in mere punishment. Her focus was on transformation. She called a press conference the next morning and addressed the city directly. I will not allow the uniform I wear to be used as a shield for prejudice, she declared. We will retrain. We will reform. And we will rise. In the days that followed, Tanya initiated a mandatory department-wide bias training program. She also announced anonymous reporting systems for officers and civilians to highlight incidents of discrimination. Brent, still under review, issued a public apology, though some speculated it was motivated more by pressure than sincerity. Tanya, however, didn't comment on it publicly. She understood the deeper work wasn't in statements, it was in changing culture. Inside the department, reactions were mixed. Some officers resented her, others respected her even more. She didn't back down. Change is uncomfortable, she said in a departmental briefing. But comfort has never been the birthplace of progress. Her words hung heavy in the air. Officers, regardless of race, began reflecting on their own behavior. For some, it was the first time they truly considered the weight of their badge beyond authority, its responsibility, its history, and its potential for harm or healing. Tanya began visiting each precinct in person. Not to lecture but to listen. She sat in break rooms, rolled up her sleeves, and asked questions. When did you first feel like a cop? What scares you about change? What does justice look like to you? Slowly, walls began to fall. Conversations opened. Officers who had felt unseen, unheard, or forced to hide their discomfort started speaking up. Tanya wasn't just leading. She was building bridges. Back in the same courtroom weeks later, Tanya returned, this time, officially introduced by the judge as the new chief of police. As she stood at the podium, she looked out over the crowd. Brent sat in the back, silent. Tanya smiled slightly, not out of victory but out of resolve. Let this courtroom remember, she said, that justice is not defined by the robes we wear, the badges we carry or the ranks we hold. It is measured by how we treat each other, especially when we think no one's watching. The courtroom had grown strangely quiet after Officer Clay's outburst. The tension in the room clung to the air like thick fog, and every eye was fixed on the woman he had just shoved and insulted, Sergeant Jordan Miles. Except of course her name tag read something very different, Chief J. Miles. No one had really paid attention to it before. They had all assumed she was just another court attendee, perhaps a witness or even a public defendant. But now, even the bailiff looked confused, stealing glances between the name tag and her calm yet commanding posture. Judge Alvarez, an older man with a reputation for fairness, cleared his throat, leaned forward and looked directly at Jordan. "Ma'am, would you care to clarify your presence here today?" he asked. Jordan Miles, still standing tall, adjusted her blazer slowly and turned her gaze toward the judge. Her eyes were steely, focused not in anger but in control. "Certainly, Your Honor," she said. "I'm here today as an observer. My name is Chief Jordan Miles. I was recently appointed Chief of Police for this district." The silence shattered into a mix of gasps and shuffles of disbelief. Officer Clay's expression contorted. First confusion, then horror, then a desperate scramble to understand what he'd just done. His jaw twitched as he tried to find words. "Chief Miles?" he murmured under his breath. But the room had heard. Everyone had. Even the clerk stopped typing. Now the pieces were falling into place. Judge Alvarez leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. "So you're here in official capacity?" he asked. Jordan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been sitting in on various cases quietly to understand the interactions between our force and the public in judicial settings. I wanted a first-hand perspective." She paused. "And now, ironically, I've experienced something no one should have to: racial profiling, physical assault, and open disrespect. All from someone under my command." The judge glanced toward the gallery where a few journalists had started scribbling ferociously. What was once a routine courtroom now felt like ground zero for a reckoning. Clay, sensing the danger of his situation, tried to step forward. "Chief, I didn't know, I thought you were," but he stopped himself, realizing that finishing that sentence could only make things worse. The implication was clear. He thought she was just another black woman. A nobody. And he had treated her accordingly. Jordan didn't even look at him. Her discipline was ironclad. She kept her eyes on the judge, on the court, on justice. "Your Honor," she said, "I am not here to derail your proceedings, but I do believe this incident requires internal and public accountability. For the court. And for the department I now lead." At that moment, Officer Clay's colleagues who had been standing in the back began to shrink into the shadows. The courtroom's layout, once so rigid and hierarchical, now felt turned on its head. The black woman he had mocked for her attitude now held the fate of his badge in her hands. But Jordan didn't lash out. She didn't scream. She didn't even demand that he be removed. Instead, she pulled out her department-issued tablet and calmly typed in a few commands. "Officer Clay," she said, her voice crisp, "you are hereby placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into today's incident. Hand your firearm and badge to the bailiff." Clay hesitated. His face turned bright red, and he looked toward the back of the room as if someone might save him. But no one moved. Not one of the officers he had laughed with. Not even his commanding sergeant. The bailiff stepped forward, hand outstretched. Trembling, Clay removed his badge, his holster, and placed them into the bailiff's palm. It was done. His world had shifted in an instant. And he knew it wasn't because he had broken a rule, it was because, for once, someone with power looked like the people he had spent years mistreating. And that power had turned the mirror on him. The public reaction was swift. Clips from the courtroom security footage began making rounds on social media that very day. The hashtags #ChiefMiles and #JusticeInCourt were trending within hours. Commentators from every corner of the political spectrum weighed in. Some saw it as poetic justice. Others as a long-overdue warning to officers who thought their badge placed them above respect and humanity. But what truly captivated viewers was not just the twist, it was Jordan's poise. Her refusal to let the incident devolve into chaos. She had dismantled a career with dignity. And built a lesson with grace. Meanwhile, at the police precinct, silence reigned in the break room. Officers who had once shared locker room jokes with Clay now sipped coffee nervously. Everyone was rethinking what they'd said, who they'd pushed, who they had dismissed as unimportant. Some even began to wonder if Chief Miles had seen them in other places, if she'd overheard their whispers, their offhand remarks, their assumptions. The realization that leadership had changed, and that leadership watched, sent chills down more spines than Clay's suspension ever could. Back in her office, Chief Miles reviewed dozens of reports that had come flooding in. Complaints, emails of support, even confessions from officers who now feared being next. But Jordan wasn't out for revenge. She never had been. Her goal was change, deep, systemic, cultural change. Her story wasn't just about personal insult. It was about holding a mirror to an institution that had too long operated in shadows. She understood the weight of leadership, and she wore it not with pride, but with purpose. Still, that night, when the cameras were off and her door was closed, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought of the thousands of women, especially black women, who had been silenced in similar settings, who hadn't been chiefs, who hadn't been believed, and she knew that her power meant responsibility not just to them, but to the generations to come. She wasn't just a chief in title, she was a symbol now. And that, more than anything, was heavier than a badge. Clay, now sitting at home, found his phone buzzing nonstop. He had become a national example. Job offers vanished. Friends ghosted him. The department refused to publicly defend him. And as he scrolled through video after video of his behavior, his face red with rage, his voice laced with hate, he saw what others had always seen. A man who believed power gave him superiority. Now he understood it only exposed his flaws. The legal process would follow. Internal affairs, review boards, and likely public hearings. But no punishment could match the self-inflicted humiliation Clay felt. And no outcome could undo what had already been etched into the national memory. Jordan Miles had stood tall not just in that courtroom but in the story of modern justice. Her quiet resistance had become thunder. In the end, what unraveled Clay wasn't just a mistake, it was his failure to recognize humanity in someone who didn't look like him. And what elevated Jordan wasn't just her rank, it was her decision to lead through restraint, vision, and integrity. This moment wasn't a fluke. It was a signal that the tides were turning, and that justice at long last had a new face. Outside the courtroom, news of the confrontation began to stir murmurs among courthouse staff. One bailiff whispered to another, "You know she's someone important, right?" But Officer Greg Thornton was too locked into his narrow worldview to even consider it. Meanwhile, Chief Alexandria Bennett walked to a side room, wiping the smudge from her cheek and breathing deeply. She wasn't just upset at the disrespect, she was angry because it wasn't the first time. Years of walking tall in her position hadn't shielded her from being seen as less than in the eyes of men like Thornton. She didn't call her assistant. She didn't alert the courtroom. She simply sat, composed herself, and checked the time. The judge was late, and something told her to let this play out just a bit longer. Back inside the courtroom, Thornton bragged to his fellow officers. "That woman's going to regret acting like she owns the place." His words dripped with arrogance and ignorance. He had no idea who he had spoken to. His fellow officer, Martinez, shifted uncomfortably. "Greg," he said slowly, "you sure she isn't on the docket?" Thornton scoffed. "Nah. Probably here to support one of her thug cousins." That moment, right there, solidified his fate. The courtroom fell quiet as the judge finally entered. Everyone rose, but as the judge took their seat, the side door opened. In walked Alexandria, composed, focused, and still wearing her department badge. Her boots echoed against the tile, and every officer's head turned. The judge peered over their glasses. "Chief Bennett, I see you've made it." Silence fell like a sheet of ice. Thornton's smug grin twisted into a confused frown. "Chief," he mouthed. Martinez stepped slightly back. "That woman you just insulted, that's our new police chief." The color drained from Thornton's face as Alexandria took a seat beside the judge, not as a defendant, not as a witness, but as a special guest called to observe courtroom procedures ahead of her swearing in. She glanced across the room at Thornton, expression unreadable. The judge leaned forward. "Chief Bennett has full authority to oversee departmental conduct. And she has just witnessed something enlightening." Thornton's voice cracked as he stepped forward. "Your Honor, I didn't realize," but the judge raised a hand. "Officer Thornton, this isn't your time to speak." That alone made Thornton flinch. His authority, once assumed, had been dismantled in seconds. Meanwhile, Alexandria remained silent. She didn't need to say anything, the power had already shifted. The officers around Thornton distanced themselves slightly, aware of the storm that was now hovering directly over him. The judge, now emboldened by the presence of the chief, ordered the courtroom into recess and invited Alexandria to debrief privately. In the chamber, Judge Holloway turned to her. "I assume this wasn't the welcome you anticipated." Alexandria allowed herself a small, knowing smile. No, she said. But it was familiar. The judge sighed. What do you want to do? For a long moment she said nothing. Then with clarity, I want this department, every inch of it, to understand that there's no room for racism, no room for disrespect, and no room for complacency. Judge Holloway nodded slowly. Then we'll begin now. And with that, they re-entered the courtroom not to conclude the day, but to change it. Thornton stood at attention, trying to salvage what dignity he had left. The judge motioned to him. Officer Thornton, do you recall your behavior earlier? He nodded hesitantly. Would you behave the same way if the person you confronted were a white man? Thornton opened his mouth then closed it. The silence answered for him. The judge turned to Alexandria. Chief, I leave the next steps to your discretion. Thornton looked at her, panic flickering in his eyes. Chief Bennett, he stammered, please? I didn't know. She finally spoke. Exactly. And that's the problem. You saw my skin and assumed everything else. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Cameras had been rolling. Reporters were already preparing headlines. Alexandria stood fully now, her presence undeniable. This isn't about me, she said. It's about how easily power can blind. You judged me before you even asked who I was. And that judgment says everything about how you serve this community. Thornton tried again. But Chief, I've served 18 years, she cut him off. And learned nothing from them, it seems. Her voice didn't rise, but every word struck like a hammer. You'll be suspended pending review, and your record will reflect your conduct today. Thornton's shoulders slumped. For the first time he understood the weight of his actions, not just their consequences but the beliefs that fueled them. Alexandria didn't gloat. There was no celebration in her tone. Only resolve. I'm not here to make an example of anyone, she said. I'm here to raise the standard. The judge dismissed the court, and as the room emptied, Alexandria stood at the front, answering reporters' questions. Her message was clear. Accountability wasn't optional. And leadership, real leadership, looked nothing like what Officer Thornton thought it did. Later that day, inside a conference room at the precinct, Alexandria sat across from several high-ranking officers. Some had known of her appointment, others had not. But now, all of them understood what kind of leader she intended to be. There's no reform without discomfort, she told them. So, get uncomfortable. Get honest. Or get out. One officer, a Latina named Officer Delgado, finally spoke. Chief, that was one of the bravest things I've seen in a courtroom. Alexandria nodded. It shouldn't have to be brave. It should be expected. Her voice never wavered. Neither did her conviction. Outside the building, a small group had gathered. Some came to protest. Some came to support. But as Alexandria walked to her car, a young black girl stepped forward. Are you really the chief? She asked. Yes, Alexandria smiled. I am. The girl's eyes sparkled. I want to be like you one day. Alexandria knelt. You can be better. Just never let anyone tell you what you can't do, especially because of how you look. The moment was brief, but it radiated power. Power that couldn't be stolen, mocked, or silenced. Not anymore. The next morning headlines read, New police chief teaches racist officer a lesson in respect, in court. Social media exploded. Some criticized her firmness. Others praised her grace. But no one could ignore her anymore. Alexandria's face, once underestimated in that courtroom, was now the face of change. And while Thornton awaited his disciplinary review, Alexandria was already back at work. Meeting with communities, building trust, and making sure no woman, especially no black woman, ever had to explain why she belonged in power again. Her first official act as chief was to implement mandatory bias training across all departments. We're not doing this to check a box, she told the force. We're doing this to rebuild trust, inside and out. Some rolled their eyes. Others nodded with cautious respect. But everyone knew, change wasn't coming. It had already arrived. Alexandria made it clear that performance would now be tied to conduct. Racism, whether subtle or overt, would not be tolerated. The days of assuming, belittling, and dismissing were over. In her office that afternoon, Alexandria placed a framed photo of her late father on her desk. A man who'd been beaten by police in the 70s for simply walking home after a late shift. This is for you, Dad, she whispered. We're finally writing a new story. Outside, her assistant knocked. Chief, CNN wants to schedule an interview. Alexandria stood, adjusted her uniform and replied, Tell them I'll speak after visiting the community center. That's who I work for. With that, she walked out not just as a chief, but as a movement. And so, what began as a moment of humiliation inside a courtroom transformed into a catalyst for justice. Alexandria didn't just confront racism, she dismantled it piece by piece through presence, poise, and unwavering principle. Officer Thornton? He became a cautionary tale, his fate hanging on a system now under new, fairer leadership. But more importantly, a community saw what it looked like when dignity answered to power, and won. Chief Bennett had arrived. Not with fury, not with vengeance, but with something far more dangerous to the status quo: truth. The courtroom, once filled with tension and disbelief, had now transformed into a place of quiet reflection. Officer Bradley's face was still pale as Chief Alexandria turned away from him, not in hatred but in leadership. Her message was clear: justice wasn't about revenge, it was about dignity. The murmurs in the room had died down, replaced by a new kind of silence, the silence that follows a lesson learned. Outside the courthouse, news reporters had already gathered, their cameras pointed toward the grand wooden doors, waiting for the new police chief to emerge. Inside, Judge Alvarez rose from his seat, nodding with respect. "Chief Reed, I trust you'll be taking appropriate action regarding today's events." She met his gaze, calm and firm. "Justice will be served. Not just for me but for everyone watching. We need change from the inside out." The judge gave her a subtle nod, understanding the magnitude of what just unfolded. As Alexandria exited, she could feel dozens of eyes watching, not in judgment but in awe. She was not just a black woman. She was not just an officer. She was a symbol of what leadership looks like when it's met with adversity and answers it with grace. Bradley, meanwhile, was escorted to an internal affairs hearing room. His world had crumbled in a matter of minutes. His past, once hidden behind badges and silence, was unraveling. Complaints from other civilians, especially minorities, began to resurface. The department, now under Alexandria's command, began reopening investigations that had once been dismissed or buried. The same officers who once laughed at Bradley's offhand comments now kept their distance, realizing their loyalty had been misplaced. Within a week, Bradley was placed on administrative leave pending termination. But for Alexandria, the work was only beginning. She didn't want him to be the headline. She wanted systemic reform to be the story. And so, she called for town hall meetings, community listening sessions, and introduced implicit bias training across every unit in her district. Some officers resisted, some grumbled, but many, especially the younger ones, were inspired. They saw what had happened in court, and for the first time they saw accountability in action. One rookie officer even wrote her a letter. "Chief, you made me proud to wear this badge again." Alexandria kept that letter on her desk as a reminder. Leadership wasn't about punishment, it was about planting seeds. News of the courtroom incident went viral within hours. Social media was ablaze with footage of Officer Bradley arrogantly barking at a black woman, only to fall silent when she revealed her badge. People were outraged, shocked, and inspired. Alexandria, however, avoided interviews at first. She wasn't seeking fame. Her mission was deeper, to change the way justice was served in her city. But the pressure to speak grew, and eventually she agreed to one interview, on her own terms. Sitting down with a respected journalist from a national outlet, she shared her truth. "This wasn't just about me," she said calmly. "It was about every woman, every black person, every officer who ever had to shrink to survive. But I won't shrink anymore." Her words resonated across the country. Activists hailed her as a model for dignified resistance. Police reform advocates pointed to her leadership as a roadmap forward. Even the mayor, who had previously tiptoed around systemic issues, issued a public statement supporting her initiatives and pledging additional funding for reforms. Schools began using her story as a teaching moment about unconscious bias and resilience. Alexandria had sparked a movement, one that started with disrespect but ended in renewal. But change doesn't come without backlash. There were protests, small but vocal, from pro-police groups who claimed she had humiliated a fellow officer. Anonymous threats were sent to her office. Some within the department tried to undermine her quietly, assigning false delays to her initiatives or misfiling reports. But Alexandria had learned long ago how to stand tall even when the wind blew hardest. She doubled down on transparency and accountability. She installed a public reporting dashboard where any citizen could track progress on misconduct cases. She initiated partnerships with black churches, community centers, and youth organizations to bridge the gap between civilians and police. Slowly the tide began to shift. Even skeptics began acknowledging the results. fewer complaints, improved response times, and a significant uptick in community cooperation. Alexandria wasn't just commanding the force, she was changing its culture. She remembered what her grandmother once told her: "You can't lead from a place of anger, but you can lead from truth. And truth always wins." She carried that wisdom into every meeting, every policy draft, every conversation with officers reluctant to change. The department, once cracked with indifference, was beginning to heal. So, what does this story mean, for you, for us, and for the country we share? It's about more than a single racist cop. It's about what happens when courage meets opportunity. When someone who's been underestimated all her life gets to write the rules. Alexandria didn't let anger write her story, she let strength, poise, and vision take the lead. In today's world, we need more leaders like her. People who aren't afraid to stand up in rooms where they weren't expected to exist, let alone command. People who remind us that real power doesn't scream, it shows up calmly and rewrites the script. So if you've ever been silenced, belittled, or told you don't belong, remember Alexandria Reed. Her story started in a courtroom filled with disrespect, but it ended with justice echoing through every hallway. And to everyone watching this, thank you for joining us on this powerful journey. If her story inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe to Craft Tales, where we bring the hidden stories of truth, power, and transformation to life. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever been underestimated and proved everyone wrong? We're listening, and your story matters too.